Alright, so to wrap up our studying of the American Revolution, we will be going over the economic and social effects of the Revolutionary War. So after we ended war with Great Britain, the United States was in major debt because we still had to pay our soldiers. The United States owed American soldiers money. We also owed our foreign aid money. So this is mainly due to the French, because we had the French army helping us out during the war, we had the French navy helping us out, and we also had France just supplying us with weapons in order to keep us in the fight for our independence. So we owe France a lot of money by the end of the war. And Congress's initial attempt to pay off these soldiers is to print out more money in order to pay all of these soldiers. But in printing out more money, or printing out more Continentals, this only led to inflation and a depression in the 1780s. Because by printing out more money and entering that into the economic system, you're really only decreasing the value of the money that's currently in the system. So by printing out these additional Continentals, this really only led to the value of American money to be almost worthless. So we see at the end of the war that the United States is in debt of $81 million, and it's broken down into three different categories. So $12 million is owed in domestic debt, $12 million is owed to our U.S. soldiers, $44 million, a big chunk of this debt is owed to our foreign aid. So a lot of this is owed to the French for their army, their navy, and their supplying of weapons. And then $25 million is in state debt. So this would be as if the state of Virginia decides that they would like to pay their soldiers off, which makes the Virginian soldiers happy. However, now the actual state of Virginia is in debt. So about $25 million from the $81 million of debt comes from this state debt. And we can see over here by this chart that anytime the United States enters into a war, we also enter into debt. Because we can see from the Revolutionary War that war is expensive. We have a lot of soldiers to pay and a lot of artillery and weapons and foreign aid to also pay for as well. So anytime that we enter into war, we're also entering into debt. War and debt are like a partnership, and where if we're not willing to spend this money in fighting the war and in the war effort, then we're most likely not going to do very well in the war. And we definitely see that as a result in the Revolutionary War. As far as trade goes, when we break up with Britain, we're breaking up with them as our trading partner as well. So we're losing our best friend and our partner in trade. And as a result, the rice, indigo, and tobacco industries will suffer in the United States. After the Revolutionary War, we also see an increase in prices of products such as British beef and sugar, because now that we are no longer a part of Great Britain, we are a foreign nation to the British Empire. And because we are a foreign nation, we are going to be paying these tariffs that's placed on foreign goods. So as a result, we're paying double for things like British beef and sugar, anything that's going to be imported into the United States from Britain. Mercantilism is also over, and as a result, we see trade with France and Spain increase. And the United States also becomes the first to trade with Spanish America. So now we're trading with Mexico, which is beneficial to us. However, we're going to see rising tensions between us and Spain as a result. Another important key is that we have no navy to protect us against pirates out on the sea. Whereas before we had the British Navy protecting our ships and protecting our goods from being overtaken by pirates, we no longer have this luxury because we are no longer a part of Britain. And we know that we have no navy of our own, so we're really vulnerable out on the seas, and we're taking risks with any trade because we know that without a navy, there's a chance that pirates could overtake our ships and overtake our goods. However, there is some good news with this new effect on trade. So we have no more restrictions on the production and what we choose to make in the United States. Whereas before, Britain would put restrictions on something as small and as seemingly insignificant as hats, to where Britain would really want us to buy British hats. So as a result, they would place a restriction on the colonies saying that you can no longer make hats any hats that you would like to purchase must come from Britain. But now that we are no longer a part of Britain, this restriction is no longer valid, as well as other restrictions similar in nature. So we see new factories being built in the cities in order to expand our economy and start to get some money back into our economic system. Some additional good news, the Proclamation of 1763 is ended, and this is when Britain had decided that they would place a boundary on the colonial territory, which said that colonists could not go any farther west than the Appalachian Mountains, and it placed a barrier between the colonists and the Native Americans, who we will talk about a little bit later on in this lecture. But now that this proclamation and this barrier, this border at the Appalachian Mountains, is no longer valid, farmers are able to move westward into new territories in order to find better land and find more profitable land. Social status. So the American Revolutionary War, it was a war that was fought for political equality and not economic equality. So the Americans really wanted that representation that we talk about so often, the representation and taxation. We needed this representation and this political equality, this idea that the government is created to protect our rights and is supported by the people, is really what the revolution was about. It wasn't so much about economic equality, because the people who were poor before the revolution were still poor after the revolution. You had a lot of soldiers who were promised pensions and promised pay and retirement for their participation and their fight for American independence, but we do not see their situation improve after the end of the war. As far as loyalists go, loyalists lose their elite ranks because there's no longer a benefit in being attached to the king and being loyal to the king. So before, where we saw loyalists who were high in rank and in high positions of power, like judges, for example, they no longer hold this elite status and this elite title. The loyalists are also not paid for their debts. So they're going into debt, they're not able to pay for their home, and many of them, they abandon their home, and Congress decides to take these abandoned homes and sell them in order to put more money back into our economic system and start to chip away at some of this debt. So 1,000 of these loyalists, they flee to Canada after the war, half of them leaving for political reasons, and half of them leaving for more economic opportunity, all in Canada. Many of the loyalists were given a hard time by Americans, so they decide it's just way easier to flee, find some political, economic opportunities in Canada, and that's what they did. We see that Congress and officers in the Army become the new upper class, and they hold the new title of the elite in America, and they begin making legislations that place limits on the poor just because it keeps the poor poor. It doesn't benefit the poor at all. And so we see that Congress and officers in the Army, they hold this new status, and they take the loyalist place as the upper class and the elite. We also see that taxes are increased for farmers in order to help pay off some of this debt, which again just reinforces that this war was really about the representation part way more than the taxation part, because we see that with this representation, we're actually increasing taxes because we understand that we have a huge debt to pay off, and the fastest way we can think is to increase taxes for the farmers. As a result, many farmers are faced foreclosure due to their own debt, because as you increase their taxes, they're going to have a harder time trying to keep up with pay. They go into debt, and as a result of that, they're losing their farms. We also see that women, African Americans, and Native Americans are still being denied their rights. Women will have to wait until 1920, African Americans will have to wait until 1960, Native Americans will have to wait until 1930, so we've still got a ways to go for these three groups to be recognized and be given their full civil rights. Even though it can still easily be argued today that these three groups are not fully recognized in their civil rights, but as far as where they stand at the end of the American Revolution, they still all have a very long way to go in this country. All right, so 1786, we see Shay's Rebellion, which is really a bunch of these poor farmers who are in debt coming together to attack the courts. And the reason why they would attack the courts is because, unlike today, where if you're in debt, you can just claim bankruptcy and get out of paying your debt, that wasn't an option around the time of the Revolution. Back in the day, if you were in debt and you couldn't pay your money, you would be arrested and thrown in jail. So many of the farmers, they were fed up with this system. They were fed up with having to be thrown in jail because we decided to increase their taxes. And so a bunch of poor farmers, led by Daniel Shay from Massachusetts, he decides to attack the courts. So as a result, you see the rich people from Massachusetts, they hire an army in order to stop the rebellion. And it's the rich who have to hire the army rather than the government, because the federal government can't afford an army at this time. And this is because the government had been purposefully made weak in the Constitution at the time, in the Articles of Confederation. So we have the rich hiring an army in order to stop this rebellion, in order to stop these poor farmers. And we also see that these rebels and these farmers, they're pardoned by Washington because most of them were veterans from the Revolution. So Washington understands that these farmers have increased taxes, that they were not paid their pensions as promised for fighting in the war. So Washington decides not to punish these farmers, but instead to start the process of state laws changing in order to protect farmers. And Shay's Rebellion is also significant because it was a major inspiration for us to write our new Constitution, the Constitution that we still hold true today, because we decide that we need a stronger federal government to suppress these rebellions and to protect the rights of the people. So Shay's Rebellion was a major influence in replacing the Articles of Confederation with a weak central government to a stronger federal government for our country. As we've touched upon lightly before, these soldiers do not see any improved status after the Revolutionary War. They're not paid their pensions as they are promised, and they have no social mobility. So they're really stuck in the same place that they were before the war started. And a lot of them do decide to move west in order to achieve status and wealth and to benefit from more opportunities. Native American tribes, they were not included in any of the peace talks or negotiations following the end of the war. And this is because at the time they were still seen as savages and less than human. And because they were considered less as human, they were not considered to be deserving of human rights. We see the war continue for the Loyalists up until 1795, this being the Loyalist tribes. And we see all the land taken from the Loyalist tribes, and some tribes, even though they tried to negotiate, they split up and do the best that they can with the situation they're given. And that's where we will stop.